Caring for vulnerable people, and particularly people living with dementia, is an important but very difficult job. Research has shown that one of the most challenging aspects of good care is communication. There are lots of reasons why communication in dementia care can be difficult. In this film, we'll focus on one of those reasons, when carers and the people they care for have different language backgrounds. The situations we'll talk about can happen in any country for any language. But just to make it simpler and clearer, we'll stick to care in the English-speaking world. So that's when the language used in a residential home or a person's own home is English. In dementia care, people from different language backgrounds could find themselves communicating for two main reasons. One is that the person being cared for grew up in a different country from the one they are in now, and English is not the first language they learned. Maybe they were never entirely fluent in English, and now they have dementia as well. The other reason is when the person giving the care grew up in a different country. So they are the one using English as their second language. And of course, you get both situations together. English is the second language for both the person living with dementia and the carer. Actually, we shouldn't forget that there are so many varieties of English that even first language speakers of English can have problems. For example, a carer from Australia could find it difficult to understand a client from Scotland. Whatever our language background, we need to be aware of possible communication challenges when we talk with other people. We need to develop language awareness when we notice how our language is received by others and how we respond to other people's language. This film is split into parts. Part 2 looks at how amazing it is to be able to speak more than one language. Part 3 shows what happens to someone's language or languages when they develop dementia. Part 4 considers the challenges for a carer who is not using their first language. In Part 5, we look at how we can use language awareness to notice particular features of pronunciation. Part 6 looks at how to manage difficulties with words, phrases and sentences. Finally, Part 7 has some extra ideas for how to make communication work as well as it can in the multilingual dementia context. The human brain is a wonderful thing. From the moment we're born, well, actually even before we're born, the brain is building connections that help us make sense of what we see, hear, touch, smell and taste, and how we feel about it all. The brain is designed to help us communicate as soon as possible. Babies start by crying to get what they need. But it doesn't take long for them to learn words, and soon they're putting the words together into fluent language. If children are exposed to more than one language at a young age, the brain just accepts that, and they become completely fluent native speakers of them all. But after just a few short years, the brain has learned certain patterns that become more difficult to change. This means that if we want to learn another language after childhood, we might never become as fluent as we are in our first language. And we might have an accent in our second language that reflects some of the sound patterns of our first language. Researchers believe that when a language is learnt after early childhood, the brain has to work harder to store and find the information. And that's important to understand. It helps explain why the combination of using a second language and having dementia is so challenging. It also helps explain something else. When we talk with someone who is using their second language, we have to concentrate a little bit harder if their pronunciation is different from what we're used to, or if they use words we weren't expecting. People who don't have dementia can usually manage that okay, because their brain can cope with a little bit of extra work. But a person living with dementia already has a lot to deal with. Their brain is damaged and not working so well. That means there isn't as much spare capacity for that extra work. So it explains why a person living with dementia might have extra difficulties communicating with a carer whose first language isn't English. Dementia isn't one thing. There are lots of different types of it, and each one affects communication differently. For example, in Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia, the routes through the brain for finding words can get blocked. That means the person's mind goes blank when they search for the name of a person, place or object. Some people with frontotemporal dementia can recognise words, but they don't know what they mean. A person with Alzheimer's disease might also not be able to recall what was said just before. As a result, they might repeat themselves, or they might not be sure what the other person is talking about. Meanwhile, in these and other types of dementia, a person might become confused about where they are, who people are, and what's happening. As a result, they might say things that don't seem to make sense. And in all types of dementia, the brain works more slowly, and so keeping up with what other people are saying can be challenging. Communication works best when each person can make an accurate guess about what the other person already knows. For a person living with dementia, some of that information might be missing, which can quickly lead to misunderstandings. Now add another language with all the extra brain work that requires, and it's clear why a person living with dementia will find it challenging. In our multicultural society, it's inevitable that some of the people who live with dementia will be speakers of more than one language. Our language is part of our identity. Everyone needs a chance to use the language they're most comfortable with, at least some of the time. As part of caring for someone, it's important to know which languages they speak and which ones they prefer to use. If a person living with dementia isn't a first language speaker of English, we can try to find staff or volunteers who can speak to them in the language they prefer. Many people who speak more than one language are comfortable switching between them, and they might know a third language that can be used as well. When people have dementia, they often become more connected with their earlier years of life than they are with the present. As a result, they might think it's appropriate to use the language they spoke at that time, or they might just prefer to. On the other hand, a person living with dementia could feel really uncomfortable about using one of the languages they know because it reminds them of difficult times in their past. Or they might be distressed when they hear others using a particular language because they associate that language with something they experienced years ago. Language awareness will help us to be observant about all of this. How does the person react when they hear that language? In the later stages of dementia, a person might no longer speak in a particular language, but they might still understand it, especially if they're spoken to slowly and with simple words. Sometimes there doesn't seem to be any language at all that we can use, but even if we can't find a way to communicate in words, we can use gestures. We can smile and give the person lots of reassurance and attention. People living with dementia are often very sensitive to our tone of voice, and using kind and calming speech can be comforting. We can also sing to them, play music, or recite a poem. Songs reflect different emotions, and they might help the person express how they feel, even when they can't talk about their feelings. Also, they might be able to clap or tap along to a cheerful song, even if it's not in a language they know. In many English-speaking countries, dementia care relies very heavily on the contribution of people who are second-language speakers of English. Most of the time, this doesn't cause any issues because the carer's English is excellent. But if a carer is still learning the language, difficulties can sometimes arise. Maria grew up in Portugal. She's lived in Britain for 3 years. Although her English is fluent, she knows it sounds different from the English of the people she cares for. Sometimes she doesn't know which word to use to get her meaning across, and she has to think a bit before she says something complicated. Chen was born in China, and he came to Australia 5 years ago. He attended English classes and then got a job as a dementia carer. Chen usually understands what people say to him, but he's noticed that when he says something, people sometimes ask him to repeat it. He knows there are a few sounds in English that are difficult for him to say, so that might explain why people don't always understand him. Maria and Chen know how important it is in their job to communicate well with people living with dementia. Without effective communication, they won't know what their clients need or how to help them. They know that a person's dementia makes it difficult to express ideas and understand what people say. They also realise that these challenges can be greater when carers like themselves are not first language speakers of English. Dementia care is a difficult job. There's lots to do, and you have to think of many things at once. That puts strain on the brain. Everyone who works in dementia care is very tired by the end of the day. Carers like Maria and Chen have extra strains because using their second language is more challenging for the brain. It might take them just a moment longer to understand what someone says to them or to think of the right word. Words are often tied to culture, and they might sometimes be concerned that although they said the right word, it wasn't okay to say it in that context. There aren't any quick solutions to all this, but there are some things that can help. The most important one is to develop language awareness. When we communicate, we usually concentrate on what we're saying. But if we want to be more easily understood, we also need to think about how we're saying it. Language awareness means noticing what happens when communication works well and when it doesn't. The great thing about language awareness is that it gets us away from the idea that someone is to blame when communication goes a bit wrong. No one's to blame. Communication is difficult, and sometimes it just won't work as well as we want. Language awareness helps us notice patterns. For example, Maria has realised that there's a particular word that she often uses that people misunderstand. If she hadn't had language awareness, she might have gone on using that word for years with the same problem. But now she's noticed, she can think about what to do. She decides to ask a colleague, why is that word a problem? And she starts to listen to which word her colleagues use in that situation. Maria has found that language awareness lets her think about what's happening and experiment with new ways of making communication work better. In fact, Maria's interest in language awareness has spread to her colleagues. Now they also discuss communication with their colleagues. Did you notice how Mrs. Brown's face lit up when I said that? I wonder if Mr. Smith doesn't understand me when I use that dialect word. I've just realised that when Mrs. Khan wakes up, the first thing she says is in Urdu. Let's ask her daughter what it means. We're going to look at some practical ideas for language awareness. Of course, each situation is different, so there isn't a single solution for everyone. We need to learn what works for us and the people we're communicating with. But there are definitely some patterns, and they're a good place to start. Language is made up of different elements: sounds or pronunciation, words, phrases, and sentences. So we'll look at each in turn. Pronunciation is how we speak the sounds of a language. Often, different people pronounce words in different ways because of the country or region they come from. When we learn another language after childhood, we often can't fully remove the influences of our first language pronunciation, and that is what people refer to as a foreign accent. If listeners aren't used to hearing that pronunciation, they might not recognise all the words, and then they might not understand what's being said. We've probably all been in situations where someone didn't understand what we said because of how we pronounced the sounds. It isn't about whose pronunciation is right or wrong, it's just how familiar that person is with the way we speak. If people aren't understanding our speech, language awareness can help us notice things to try. That's particularly important if we're communicating with a person living with dementia. The first thing to check is whether the person knows we're talking to them. Do we have their attention? Getting eye contact is an important first step. Next, are they able to hear us okay? If there's a lot of background noise, such as from the television, radio, or activities going on, they simply might not pick up the sounds. And if they have hearing problems, we need to check that they're wearing their hearing aids. If they need to lip read, or if we're showing something to them, we need to check they're wearing their glasses as well. If all these things are okay, but the person still doesn't seem to recognise what we're saying, it's time to check whether our pronunciation is creating difficulties. English has several tricky sounds. These are sounds that you don't find in some other languages around the world. After childhood, our brain and our tongue can find it difficult to make the sounds of new languages. We can use language awareness to notice which sounds are difficult for ourselves or other people, and to observe how first language speakers say them. Here are some examples of sounds in English that can be difficult. There are two sounds in English that are spelt with TH. They're both made with the tongue between the teeth. One of them is heard at the start of thing and at the end of bath and breath. The other one is found at the start of this and then and at the end of bathe and breathe. If a second language speaker of English doesn't have these sounds in their first language, they're most likely to replace them with t and d or with s and z. So thing sounds a bit like ting or sing. This sounds a bit like dis or zis. Actually, so many second language speakers make these replacements that it's rarely a problem for communication. Everyone's very used to hearing them. But it's still good for our language awareness to notice them, because occasionally someone might not understand which word has been said. Another sound in English that many other languages in the world don't have is the one spelt with a W, as in wet and wish. Usually, if a second language speaker's language doesn't have that sound, they'll replace it with v. So wet sounds a bit like vet, and wish sounds a bit like vish. In English, there are words beginning with L, such as light, and also words that begin with R, such as right. Not all languages have both L and R, and first language speakers of those languages might find it difficult to hear and pronounce the difference. It might mean they use L for both or R for both. Some people might use W or W for both, so that light and right both sound a bit like white. People who speak English as their first language are expecting differences between L and R and W, and so they might not be sure which word was said. Language awareness is the tool for noticing whether these sounds are causing any difficulties in communication. If they are, then realising that fact is the first step to finding a solution. The speaker doesn't necessarily have to change their pronunciation. If they realise which word the listener hasn't recognised, they could simply explain. For example, they might point to the object they meant, or they might say, I mean light with an L. Each person can invent their own experiments and see if they help with communication. In English, the sounds written as P and B are distinct. For example, English has pound and also bound. But in some other languages, that distinction doesn't exist. If a second language speaker of English doesn't have both sounds in their first language, then a listener might not be sure which word they said. Pie and buy might sound the same, and at the end of words, cup and cub. Usually it'll be obvious from the context which words meant, but occasionally it might cause confusion. If that happens with p and b, there's likely to be the same issue with t and d. That means that to and do could sound very similar, and at the end of words, root and rude. And there might also be an issue with k, c or k, and g. If so, then coat and goat will sound similar, and at the end of words, pick and pig. Listeners who don't have dementia will usually easily work out what was meant from the context. But a person living with dementia might not be following the conversation very well, so they haven't got as many clues to help them. Next, we'll look at words. Because of the way the brain stores and accesses information, it's often harder to find words in our second language than our first language. We already saw that dementia causes difficulties with words. People living with dementia might not be able to find words they've used in the past. They might not recognise words that are spoken to them. If a person living with dementia is also using a second language, that's two reasons why they might not find the word they're looking for. Meanwhile, if their carer is using a second language, the person living with dementia might not be able to guess what word they meant to say. Here are some ways to manage situations where someone in the conversation can't say or can't understand some of the words. We can make sure there's lots of context. Context is the information that makes it easier to guess what's meant. For example, we can point to something when we refer to it. We can mention the name of a person rather than saying she or him. We can start off with saying something that helps the person recognise the context. For example, instead of just saying, "It's raining," we might say, "Oh, look outside, look at the weather, it's raining." Instead of saying, "Joe's coming this afternoon," we might say, "You're going to have a visitor. Joe's coming for a visit this afternoon." If we give more context and use more words, then there's more information for the person to use to help them understand. Now let's think about phrases. Some phrases are particularly useful to learn because everyone will easily recognise them and they can be used in many situations. Some examples are "Good morning," "How are you today?" "See you later," "What would you like?" "Let me help you," "I'm sorry," "Happy birthday," "Excuse me." By the way, whenever we can, we should use the name of the person we're talking to as well. We need to find out the name they prefer us to use. Here are some phrases we can use if we don't understand what the other person said. "Please, can you say that again?" "Please, could you repeat that?" "I'm sorry, I didn't understand." Here are some useful phrases related to the daily work of care. "May I help you with that?" "Would you like me to walk with you?" "Are you feeling okay?" "If it's all right with you, I'd like to." "Are you ready for?" "Can you please?" We can learn extra phrases by listening to what other people say and practicing the same ones. If the person living with dementia speaks another language, we could try to learn a few useful phrases in that language as well. Their family might be able to suggest which ones. Finally, we'll consider sentences. Sentences can get quite long, and it's a good idea to keep them simple. When we have something complicated to say, we can break it into smaller parts. It's a good idea to only mention one topic at a time. And after we've spoken, we need to give the person time. to respond. When someone speaks a sentence, the pitch goes up and down. We call that intonation. Different types of English have different intonation patterns, so we can't say there's just one correct way to use intonation. But if a listener isn't used to our particular intonation patterns, they might misunderstand us. In English, a typical misunderstanding is whether the person made a statement or asked a question. If the listener has dementia, they might not be able to use context to help them decide. We can observe the intonation patterns that different people use, and that information can help us work out what the listener's expecting. Now let's think about some other changes we can make when the person we're communicating with has dementia. One important tip is to repeat things patiently if the person didn't understand first time. If we aren't sure we've understood them, one good idea is to say back to the person what we think they just said in different words and ask them if that is correct. People living with dementia often get anxious about communication. If they're also using their second language, or if their carers are using a second language, there's even more chance that they'll get anxious because their brain has so much to cope with. If they do get anxious, they could become agitated. Or they might just go quiet. For example, they might not start conversations. They might look away. Or if they don't understand what we said, they might not tell us. When a person with dementia ignores us, we might think they don't like us or aren't interested. It's easy to think that if they're not communicating, it means they can't or don't want to. Well, that might be the case, but perhaps they would actually like to communicate, but are nervous. If they're nervous, then we need to help them feel more confident. We can't expect the person living with dementia to fix the problems. It's up to us to try some different approaches. Communication is important. How can we keep positive and practical even when it's difficult? This is where language awareness is a really powerful tool. We can think, what happened? How could I avoid that next time? Everyone who works in dementia care will have difficulties with communication sometimes, so we can work with others. We can ask our colleagues for ideas. We might say to a colleague, when I talk to that person, often this happens. Can you help me work out why? Do you think they don't understand me? What else could I say or do? We can talk to the person's family. They might have good ideas about what to try. And the more we learn, the more others will learn from us. We can help them and make everyone's communication better. Finally, there's no need to see language differences as a problem. They're a great opportunity as well. Languages are amazing. Have you ever wondered how many different languages are spoken by the people in your workplace? Each one is valuable. What talented people we have around us. There are some great ways to celebrate the various languages in our community. If it's nice weather, we can find out how to say it's sunny today in different languages. Or we can choose something that we all eat or drink and find out everyone's name for it. For example, potato or a cup of tea. We can ask everyone who's able to practice a friendly greeting in someone else's language and use it. That way, everyone recognises how good it is to speak more than one language. There's something else too. It can be difficult to really understand what it's like for a person who's living with dementia. They have problems understanding what others say and following what's going on. They can't find the words they want. They might have difficulty expressing themselves easily. In a care situation, the people who might have most understanding about these difficulties are the ones who use English as a second language. That's because they probably experienced the same kinds of thing when they were learning English. Because they know what it feels like, they're likely to be very patient and understanding. They can help their colleagues appreciate just how difficult it is for people living with dementia and show them what might help. To sum up, we can all feel isolated if communication is difficult. A person living with dementia has particular challenges. The disease is probably already causing communication problems. They might not be able to express how they're feeling as easily as they used to. This might leave them confused, upset, and anxious. If we or they are using a second language, it can create additional challenges. Language awareness is the best tool for finding imaginative ways to support people with dementia to communicate as well as they can. Communication is vital for our well-being. If we can help communication to be better, everyone will benefit.